So let's now look at definitions themselves. And one of my favorite quotes for definitions is, and obviously this is from Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, the question is whether you can make words mean different things. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said, in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be the master? That is all. So in other words, what I'm provocatively saying is, well, dyslexia is what you want it to be. And in the same way that everybody can be their own master, so everybody can choose exactly who they follow. Who has the authority to say which definition is correct? The answer is nobody has that authority. So if we go back, I try to embed us a little within the theoretical components as well. So I thought we could try and say, well, what is a definition trying to do? And the answer is that well, as Robinson said, it suggests the reason to provide a definition include not only how words should be used, but also provide a set of conditions in which something occurs. Now, in other words, what are the symptoms of dyslexia? What are the when should we be using it? Now, Elaine Miles, this is Elaine Miles, not the late Professor Tim Miles. Elaine Miles did a very good paper in 1995, which said, with specific reference to dyslexia, it should provide a guide to diagnosis, which is absolutely true. I agree with that. I think the next one, finding a watertight legal description that will automatically give entitlement, is a little optimistic. And the main reason is that definitions do not give criteria. And you cannot give a legal watertight description without that very specific criteria of who gets and who does not get. But it's also showing off one's pet theory. So if I give you a definition, you could argue, well, it's just my opinion. It's my idea. Looking at it in a slightly different way, why do we need it? To provide help and support an individual, to provide help and support an individual, we need to identify characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs. And that's from the Salamanca Declaration of 1994. It has led to some changes in legislation, but it has not been adopted worldwide. But then we still have to ask, do we actually need a definition of dyslexia? Why can't we just do as that Salamanca Declaration says, identify the characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs? Isn't that the notion of a needs analysis, which of course is the second talk, which is about assessment? So this itself is questioning whether we should be looking at a label for the individual, or we should be identifying their characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs. The problem is that even if you do believe you need a label, then once you have that label, you still need to identify the abilities and those learning needs. So does that mean we don't need a label? Well, in theory, no, we don't need a label. But in practice, of course, as particularly in the UK, we know that resources cannot be accessed unless you have that specific label. In other words, if the funder says diagnosis to a label is required, then you need to diagnose to that label, and therefore you need a definition to make sure your diagnosis conforms to it. But it doesn't tell you the tools to use, and it doesn't tell you the cutoff criteria. So if we were to look at a whole series of different people who provide us with definitions, we've got the Health Organization of the Netherlands, World Health Organization, NICHD, British Psychological Society, British Dyslexia Association, me. But who would you choose as the people to follow? Whose definition would you actually accept? Because in the end, you have to accept one, or you invent your own. Obviously, those who are listening would choose my definition. If we look at them, they're all remarkably similar. So we've got it's present when the automatization of word identification and or spelling does not develop or does so incompletely or with great difficulty. The British Psychological Society, dyslexia is evident when accurate and fluent word reading and or spelling develops very incompletely. And the IDA and ICHD is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition. Okay. Don't want to dwell too long on these. Remember, you will be able to review these later. This is my one. Okay? As I said, you can believe whoever you like, but mine's been given slightly more space. Dyslexia is a difficulty in the acquisition of literacy skills that's neurological in origin. It's evident when accurate and fluent word reading, spelling, and writing develops very incompletely. The important part is a difficulty in the acquisition. It's not how good you are today. It's a difficulty in the acquisition. And working with multilinguals, you actually find that's very, very important. In the UK or any monolingual country, you will always assume that all the children have the same background. Therefore, if one particular child is not doing well, it must be because they are dyslexic or they have some other specific cause. So everybody's had the opportunity, but if they're multilingual, maybe they haven't had the opportunity, or they've had the opportunity, but the teacher of, let's say, phonics was very bad. I did a lot of work on multilinguals coming from China and Hong Kong about 10 years ago. And I was called into a number of schools where they were very concerned about the individuals, a number of individuals being dyslexic. It turned out that they all said that they'd been taught phonics at school, but the teaching of phonics was very poor. And indeed, I was part of a team looking at the improvement out of the phonics itself in Hong Kong. It's caused by a combination of, this definition was about 4 years ago. I'm not so worried about that. I believe in the first part is the important part. It's the symptoms. The symptoms are, they tell you what you need to have in a definition. If you do an assessment for dyslexia, you have to prove what's in the definition. You have to prove the fluency and accuracy of reading, writing, and spelling. If that is not in the if that's not in the assessment, then that label of dyslexia cannot be given. So we've said, I've said here, it can be caused by a combination of, and that's really like a combination of everything, which again we'll talk about more in the assessment section, where I will highlight the most probable areas. But again, we'll come back to that one in just a moment. Excuse me. And the manifestation of dyslexia in any individual depend upon not only individual cognitive differences, but also the language used. That will be more widely discussed in the section in the talk on multilingualism, where, for example, a quick example, the phonics there is not so important in, say, Hungarian, but the issues related to memory are very important. The phonics isn't so important because it's a very transparent language. A quick one here is that this is the European Dyslexia Association definition. I was actually present at the meeting. I had a little influence on it. My definition of difficulty in the acquisition of, and the European one, it's a difference. And I like to highlight it because if it's a difference, well, surely everybody is different. And if everybody is different, who is the government going to fund? If you've got a difficulty, the government may fund a difficulty, but they're not going to fund a difference. And therefore you have to accept that dyslexia is a disability or a difficulty in order to get the funding. That's an interesting argument for all those who turn around and say, but it's society that has the difficulty. We're a neurological difference. We're not a difficulty. I totally agree. I absolutely agree. The problem is the danger of losing funding if you go to your funder and say that. This one, maybe this is more of the science. I will come back to this in the science one. But the definition that the IDA and NICHD use says unexpected in relation to cognitive abilities. But the whole basis of all their research is to identify that the difficulties, the abilities are all different areas. In other words, one does not predict another, so why would it be unexpected? And the other is, how can you say, despite the provision of effective classroom instruction? Surely, if a dyslexic individual is failing in the classroom, the classroom instruction could not have been effective. And it might sound pedantic, but if these people are making definitions that are in effect embedded within the provision, in other words, in America, this is an American definition, in America you can actually get medical insurance because of the basis of this definition. So let me talk for a moment about concepts, because one of the things that I like to do is empower people, and it's very simple. There'll be a number of teachers who are listening today who want to give the idea back to others, who are still hesitant about accepting the word dyslexia, about the concept of dyslexia. And it's quite simple. If we can think in terms of people come in different heights, different sizes, we accept that, no problem. Just because we know their height doesn't mean to say we know their hand size or their glove size. And just because we know that both their height and their glove size doesn't mean to say we know their shoe size, because every individual is very slightly different. And it's actually the same with the brain. In the brain, just because we know what's happening in one part of the brain doesn't mean to say we know what's happening in another part. The connections will be very slightly different. But it's that slight difference that creates the differences between us, and in some cases those differences in the key areas will impact upon the literacy learning skills. The difference is that in those neurological links within the brain, we can't see them, whereas we can see the height, the hand, and the shoe. So the fact that it's hidden means we've taken a lot longer to accept that it is actually real. It is there. Another issue we have is that, again, we tend to think in terms of trying to come up with a very clear concept. So, for example, the concept of a square, and I apologize for my repeated coughing, the concept of a square is that it's got to have 4 sides of equal length. It's closed, and the sides are all the sides join at 90 degrees. If all those criteria are true, what we have is a square. But also, if we have a square, all those criteria must be true. So that's very simple. The problem is that with a dyslexic individual, there's not the same commonality between individuals. Now, I happen to have access to 20 individuals. We had over 1,000 individuals. I chose 20 of them, and I tracked over a series of 20 questions, their responses. And if dyslexia was the same in every person, then everybody would be at the same level. Whether it's a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4, doesn't matter. But if every dyslexic was the same, then the responses would be the same. But you can see from the diversity that's not the case. We actually don't need to know the questions. It's irrelevant. These are actually questions related to the identification of dyslexia. But they all have different responses. So what is good for one person may be bad for another. What's bad for another may be good for another. But combining them comes up with an overall difficulties. So let's have another little look at one particular area of individual differences, which is the gender issue. Now, it used to be said that there would be 3 times as many boys identified as there were girls. And for a start, people accepted it, and then they said, oh, maybe it's to do with the way that we identify. Maybe it's the boys become more noisy, disruptive, so the teacher identifies them. Then you get things like, well, maybe the teacher is then expecting the boys to be dyslexic, so it's looking for them and isn't actually looking for the girls. And you get lots of arguments like that. And over time, the number of individuals, as I say, the ratio between the boys and girls actually dropped. And I think the last published one I saw was about a ratio about 1.1 to 1. So basically the same. And then just to confuse the issue, a couple of years ago, we got a nice little paper out from Dick Olson and others out of Colorado that said, yes, the average for the boys and the girls was the same. And you can see the peaks of these two is identical. And to be honest, I have exaggerated a little for the graphic effect here. So the peak of the girls, yes, pink, is in the same place as the peak for the boys, yes, blue. But the girls don't vary so much from the middle, but the boys vary a lot. So you can have a lot of very good boys, a lot of very poor boys. Now the problem is we have one cutoff for all dyslexic individuals. So if we set it where that red bar is, oh my goodness, we're going to end up with more boys than girls. And it's too early to see people doing research on the consequences of that research by Olson, but there is a probability that we may end up saying, well, does that mean we need to have a different norming process, different criteria for girls than boys? I'm actually not going to answer that one. That's for somebody else to argue, the notion of resource allocation and gender differences. So we've just said about the percentages, and the British Dyslexia Association will be very happy to say that 10% of the population is dyslexic, and of that maybe 4% are severely dyslexic. But is that true? Where does that number come from? The answer is the number is actually exactly what you want it to be, as Humpty Dumpty would probably say. The quote I tend to use is Maggie Snowling, who in her book Dyslexia in the year 2000 correctly pointed out that if 2.28% of the population is 2 standard deviations, so if you decide your cutoff criteria is 2.2 standard deviations below the norm, below the mean, then you'll get 2.28%. Change your cutoff and you'll get a different percentage. It really is that simple. And it's so simple that a lot of people actually can't quite grasp it. Put it another way. If Professor Maggie Snowling says, we will use 2 standard deviations, which gives 2.28%, and Professor John Smith says, no, we'll use 1 standard deviation, and instead of being 2.28%, you end up with 13%. But who's going to be correct? Professor Snelling or Professor Smith? And that, again, is one of the problems. It's not like a broken leg. You've either got a broken leg or you haven't. Interesting one. And I'm going to have to go fairly quickly because I do apologize that I get so excited with the subject matter, I tend to lose track of the time. But I thought I'd talk about, for a second, about Japanese, and it's often reported that there's no dyslexia in Japanese. And that's because it's a misquote of the work of Makita, who said it was less than 1%. If you go back to the original research, the question that Makita asked of teachers, Japanese teachers in classes was, do you have any kids struggling learning to read and write in your class? Social convention, every teacher just says no. A few says yes. So it comes out at 1%. What my provocative question would be is, if you were to ask teachers in 1962 in the UK, how many would actually say, oh, there's some in here that my skills aren't good enough to teach them? I suspect you'd come out with a very similar answer to that of Makita. If we look at individual differences, the idea is that we've got these cognitive skills, which we'll look a little bit closer at in the assessment module of what I think of as a course. All of those specific cognitive skills, the phonological, orthographic, short-term memory, and working memory, they all impact upon the reading, writing, note-taking, listening, comprehension, time management. All those areas that we know about are important for the dyslexic individual. So all of those skills impact to a lesser or greater extent on each of those. So we can have these, what we call the behavioral outcomes, are impacted by a whole series of different processes. Now, where that gets very interesting is if we start to look at what some people call co-occurrence or comorbidity of issues such as dyslexia, ADHD, and DCD or dyspraxia, developmental coordination difficulties. Now, I just highlighted some of the cognitive skills, such as the phonological. Phonological will impact upon the dyslexia. Okay, motor skills, on the other end, will impact upon the developmental coordination difficulties or dyspraxia. But things like executive functioning will actually impact on the dyslexia, the ADHD, and the DCD, as will motor skills. So if the problem is in the executive function, you could find a lot of comorbidity. You could find a lot of individuals who end up being identified as both dyslexic and, shall we say, DCD, and they have these common issues. So large parts of the DCD may be caused by that executive function issue. Large parts of the dyslexia may be caused by that executive functioning issue. So a simple little model like this helps us understand that co-occurrence issue. I brought this one up really as a reminder about the notion of a social versus the medical, because it does keep coming up and people misunderstand it. People think about, people keep trying to say we must be following a social model. We should make it available to everybody. But by the way, can I have this specialist piece of technology? Can we have a voiced version of this book for this specific child? Well, why aren't we giving it to everybody? There was an incident of when Amazon were trying to introduce their voiced Kindles a few years ago, a student objected because the Kindle was not accessible enough to the blind student. So actually Amazon had to withdraw it for every single individual, including all the dyslexic individuals. In other words, everybody suffered because it wasn't good for everybody. Now, I will fight and I will argue for open for everybody in the same way that the Scottish government gives text-to-speech to everybody. But I think we have to be careful of either saying one or the other. What we need to do is help as many individuals as possible through the appropriate means. So I thought we'd actually then look at what that means in terms of a checklist. Now, this is a checklist I've used for some time, and I just wanted to go through it and just try and think in terms of whether we're talking about a symptom or we're talking about a correlate. In other words, is it something that is actually to do with dyslexia, or is it something that just predicts dyslexia? And if it predicts why is it there? What are we trying to do with it? So, and in doing so, in discussing it in this way, we should hopefully understand dyslexia a little better. So obviously the difficulty in reading is a symptom, as is the difficulty in writing. Difficult to read the handwriting. Now, okay, so I've given you a few seconds, but let me now ask you a rhetorical question. How long did it take you to realize that, in fact, that's written by a Chinese individual? I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of teachers out there saying, oh, yes, I recognize that, dyslexic. It's all over the place. It's difficult to understand. Yes, it's Chinese, unless we happen to have Chinese individuals who can specifically read this. Most of you won't immediately have picked that up. But dyslexia in Chinese, yes, there are many dyslexic Chinese, and I could easily show that the percentage of percentage of dyslexia in Chinese is identical to the. Sorry, I'm getting a question here. If any chance that the microphone volume can be turned up? I've moved the microphone slightly. I'm hoping that's a little bit better now. Okay, confusing words. Again, this isn't specifically in the definition, but there are many individuals who will confuse, for example, doctor and nurse, lamppost and lampshade. The dyslexic individual needs extra time. It's an identifier, and obviously it's a consequence of being slower to read and to write. Problem with maths. A lot of people, in this particular picture, we have what I would think of as the pure problem-solving maths, as opposed to trying to read the question and answer the mathematical problem that the words create, but then you've got the confound of having to read in the first place. So it's the reading component. The problem with maths has its own name, dyscalculia, and we have Dr. Steve Chin is doing some talks for Do It, and you'll find details of that on our website. But dyscalculia is that specific problem. However, there's a strong co-occurrence of dyslexia and dyscalculia because of those underlying issues that affect both sides. Difficulty of telling left from right. I've never quite been able to decide what it is that causes it, and all I can say is that as you sit and look at your computer screen, you know precisely which is the left-hand side of the screen. But if you now went to the other side of the computer, which side is the left-hand side of the screen? It's the opposite of what it was before. In other words, the left-hand side is not fixed for anything apart from yourself. Up is fixed, down is fixed. But the left-hand side of the room depends on which way you're facing. Difficulty in concentration. Again, it's that issue is technically it's a difficulty in the concentration, or is it just that something else is more interesting outside and anything to avoid that reading process? Difficulty in telling the time. A small question for anybody out there. I haven't yet seen a piece of research that compares telling the time for dyslexic individual using this analog clock in the illustration here, as opposed to the digital clock. I'd be very curious if anyone actually knows the difference on that one. Difficulty with instructions. That's about remembering a whole series of instructions in order to particularly say to play games. A lot of children have problems following instructions to play games, but if you add on the issues of trying to somebody else is saying that the audio is rather quiet. I'm afraid there's not a lot more I can do about that. The microphone is very close to my voice already, and I'm talking quite loud. Okay, apparently Justin's saying it's now good. Okay, so the instructions, it's that idea of taking several instructions at once. This is again It's not a direct symptom, but it's a good predictor, and it's related to dyslexia. Most dyslexic individuals have this problem, but it's not one of those symptoms. Difficulty in clapping a rhythm. I find this is a curious one. It's a predictor, but obviously it's not related to a difficulty in the acquisition of fluent and accurate reading and writing skills. But I find there is a little one that very few people see, which is the clapping a rhythm is the same as a test of syllables. You try listening to a song and clapping along with the song. When you're clapping, you're actually clapping the syllables. So isn't it curious that a dyslexic individual will have difficulty acquiring the skill to do syllables and a difficulty in clapping a rhythm? Gets frustrated very easily. Trouble tying shoelaces. Again, this is really a dyspraxia DCD one, but nonetheless, a lot of dyslexic individuals do have trouble doing it, because there are two issues here. One is the physical motor skill, the hand tying it, and that one is very much a dyspraxia issue. But the other is more like what some people refer to as executive functioning, the planning and organization. Which piece of string goes over which before which, and then do I turn that piece over the top or the bottom, or where do I go with it? The nice thing about quantum physics is that you've got simple equations, and here we've got nice little Einstein's equation of general relativity and Schrodinger's wave equation. Everybody agrees with it. The problem is that we don't have something like this within the field of dyslexia. Now, what I did a few years ago was I came up with this Star Trek version, which is Data, the android, is saying, Captain, I cannot find the word dyslexia in my data banks. Can you tell me what it means? So Jean-Luc Picard is saying, it was used in the late 20th and early 21st century for those who struggled to learn to read and write before we learned how to teach effectively. Turned out that those individuals who were originally rejected by society had exceptional skills in some areas and are now our top students in the Starfleet Academy. In other words, maybe our skills are changing. That was originally written in 1997, a long time before the tablet was invented. But now look at the way a 2-year-old can use a tablet when they can't read. So it's the visual skills, and maybe there are a lot of visual skills. Maybe there are skills that will be developed because you can't learn to read and write, and therefore are advantageous to the dyslexic individual. Maybe those are areas we should be thinking of. This final bit is, this actually came from a guy. This is a Nobel Prize winning, physics prize winning guy called Feynman, Richard Feynman. And this is a cartoon illustrating his, cartoon book illustrating his life, and I particularly like this one because I thought it worked here. Well, that's the great mystery, Joni. Like that says, it has a name so people think they understand it. And you can immediately see me slotting in the word dyslexia. But I don't think anybody really does. Maybe someday. Who knows? Okay, so that is the end of my talk. I apologize for overrunning. My next talk is the assessment in dyslexia one, as I mentioned earlier. And thank you again for listening. Justin, do you want to come in at this point?
Yes, thank you, Ian. And just a reminder that you will be receiving an email here in the next 24 hours with a link to the recording and the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you all for joining, and have a great evening.